down by the Romans in the years 70 and 135. So as a result of both of those combined, really since 135 AD, from that point on, you have what is known as the Jewish diaspora, or scattering. In a sense, well, in essence, Jews being flushed out of the majority of what we know as Israel. After 135, the predominant center of the Jewish population became a city called Tiberias up in the far north. But certainly Judea and Samaria, the kind of biblical Old Testament and New Testament heartland of Judaism, but that was not the case anymore because the Romans had pretty much ran Jews out of the country. And it's not that, at any particular time in those intervening centuries, I wouldn't say if you would have scoured every square inch of the entire country, you wouldn't have found one person who identified ethnically or religiously as Jewish, but you certainly would have had a hard time finding many. So fast forward many centuries from, again, 70 and 135 AD, fast forward until the mid to late 1800s. A couple of things are going on there. Number one, in very general terms, the 19th century is a time when really all across Europe, nationalism is a wave that is spreading, particularly getting into the late 1800s. In other words, a rediscovery, appreciation, emphasizing of one's own cultural and national heritage, and wanting to really emphasize that and learn about that and lift that up. So of course you have Jews living all across Europe at that point, as you had for centuries. But of course, unlike other peoples of Europe, the Jews had no land that was theirs. Because again, they ran out of their own country since 70 and since 135 AD. And for the majority of those intervening years, you had what we know as Israel, as Palestine, in control of various dynasties, and just what it boils down to is different branches of the family tree of Muslims, the Muslim period, from the late 600s all the way down to World War I. So you have Jews with no homeland, scattered for many centuries. So again, in the late 1800s, nationalism is sweeping across Europe. And as kind of a part of that movement, but also something more specific, Jews have a history prior to the 1800s of being singled out, of being persecuted in Europe. It's funny how things change. Once upon a time in our world history, no one wanted to be the bankers, the money handlers, because that was looked at as something that would bring corruption and would kind of taint you. And so for a large deal of Europe's history, that task of being the bankers, of being the money handlers, was given to Jews, because the jobs that if we don't want to do it, we'll just let kind of the outsiders among us do it. Funny how things have changed right now. It's banking executive, well, that's high cotton, right?
Right.
Yeah. Flip side of that is when anything hiccuped with the economy, guess who got blamed? The folks who were handling the money and managing the banks and the banking system. So that's just one little piece of an excuse really that was used in the late, in the 16th, well certainly 1800s, that led to some of the Jewish persecution that went on in Europe. But again, due to Jews having a homeland of their own, experiencing persecution in Europe, and this overall sweeping wave of nationalism that's taking place in Europe, certainly by the late 1800s, you have an individual in the 1800s named Theodor Herzl. He's known as the father of modern Zionism. Zionism just being the idea that Jews need to have a homeland, a place that is, we're not living among, we're not foreigners living among others in someone else's land, that we can have a place that we can call our own land in which to live. And actually, Israel, biblical Israel proper, was not the first place that Herzl looked. It may surprise you to know that Zionism, this idea that Jews should have a homeland, it began as a very secular, non-religious movement. That's the way it started. And it was not anything to do with the biblical promises to Abraham and Abraham's descendants and the promised land being given to the Jews, etc., etc., etc. It began strictly as a secular movement, again, as part of this larger wave of nationalism across Europe in the late 1800s. But as the years roll on and you get into the early 1900s, you do have the focus of Zionism really becoming more on Israel. Because again, particularly as we get into the modern period, it's not like there was not one Jew to be found in all of Israel. I'll lead it many times, very, very few. Let me give you some population numbers here. These being, of course, somewhat estimated. In 1914, about 85,000 Jews in Israel, in the entire country. About the same figure in 1922. But then by 1931, 175,000. By 1936, 385,000. By 1939, 500,000. So you can see as we get into the early 1900s, more and more Jews, more and more Zionists are thinking, if there's going to be a place that we can go and call our own, that is going to be it. Now, of course, you got to throw into the mix of all that's going on in the early 1900s, World War I. Right? World War I coming to an end, and the last Muslim dynasty that ruled the region, Israel, Palestine included, was the Ottomans, the Ottoman Turks. And with the end of World War I, that Ottoman Empire, which included Egypt and modern Jordan, modern Israel, Palestine, modern Turkey, modern Syria, modern Lebanon, France, Germany, England, especially, even Russia to a large extent, broke those up among themselves after the end of World War I to administer, the idea being they would eventually get them on their feet as independent nations in and of themselves. The thing was that all of the logistics and who had what and who was managing what and exactly what would take place to lead to nationhood for certain areas, it really wasn't, you might say, managed all that well. As a matter of fact, when it comes to Israel, Palestine, Great Britain actually made some conflicting promises in terms of who would get what. For example, the Arab population, particularly of southern, what we now call Israel, were pretty much assured that, hey, if you will help us in the war effort against the Ottomans, against the Turks, we will remember you post-victory, and you will have autonomy of this land for yourselves. And so there were some conflicting promises made along those lines when the war was still going on, and Great Britain and others were trying to do all they could to muster all the help they needed to win the war. One promise, if you will, that sticks out is in 1917, the Balfour Declaration, which essentially was a promise, a pledge, I guess that is the word I'm looking for, to work for the establishment of a Jewish homeland, in some respects, again, in exchange for assistance in the war effort after the war ended. So with that being, becoming common knowledge, and again, with Zionism becoming more and more attached to Israel, with those numbers I just showed you, you can see how you have more and more folks who identify culturally as Jews immigrating from Europe back to Israel. Now, some more numbers to share with you. Palestine was not just an empty land. There were folks living there. While there were 24,000 Jews there in 1882, there was 250,000 Arabs, predominantly Muslim. When there were 60,000 Jews in what we call Israel Palestine, in 1918, there was over 500,000 Arabs. So it wasn't like it was just an empty land that these increasing numbers of Jews were coming back to from Europe. And given the uneasiness, the turmoil that World War I brought, you've already seen how small a piece of real estate we're talking about when it comes to Israel, Palestine. And you have those kinds of surging numbers of very different cultures and even faiths, tension is bound to happen. So, for example, in the 30s, in the late 30s, 36 to 39, there was in fact an Arab uprising, an outright revolt against the British mandate. In other words, the post-World War arrangement that Great Britain had autonomy over what was then known as Palestine, and it would be in charge of whatever status it came to take. That was Great Britain's responsibility. That Great Britain was managing that, the British mandate. So that Arab rebellion was in the late 30s, and during that time there were some uncalled for, terrible atrocities committed by Arabs against Jews, who were viewed as, an influx of outsiders coming in, who, it was probably by that point becoming well known, hoped to actually be able to lay claim to that as a homeland in some way, shape, or form at some point in the very near future. And that made the Arabs, obviously, understandably very nervous. And so this revolt breaks out against Britain's control of the region, and in the mix, many Jews were hurt and killed because of it. Well, it didn't take even 10 years later for Great Britain to realize, we don't know what to do with this mess. That's what it turned into. We can't handle this. United Nations, take over. It's pretty much just the Reader's Digest version of what happens. April 1947. Britain essentially turned Palestine, what to do with it, how to manage it, how to move it forward in its own political status, over to the United Nations. And the United Nations came up with what's called the United Nations, the UN Partition Plan. In November of 1947 is when that was put forth, as a way to divide the territory of Palestine essentially into two separate states. Let me get this back up and show you this graphic. And I'll just focus on the part right here, what we would call biblical Israel. The part in white was to be the newly established Jewish state, and these portions here in light gray were to be the official state of Palestine. So you were to have two states in this land that was formerly not an independent nation, but just a region of the larger Ottoman Empire. And this was going to establish two separate states in that territory. And if you look at that, as far as where the white is and where the light gray is, you think, who in the world drew that? But it was actually an effort to designate those two state areas as best could be done without really getting crazy with the boundaries, where the respective populations already were. It was in this area here where you had a high concentration of Arabs. It was in these white areas, in this neck of the woods, and even down here, where you had the higher concentrations of Jews. So the United Nations tried with the partition plan to kind of pretty much where most of the Jews were already living, that's going to be a Jewish state. And where most of the Arabs were already living, that's going to be a Palestinian state.